So, Jiva, you said we were going to talk about boxing next, but you also mentioned NSNumber in our introduction, so I'm guessing that's probably an integral part, so that's where we should start.
Sure. Well, so the concept behind boxing, we talked about collections, and we talked about how you can't put scalar types into collections. So essentially, the idea behind boxing is that what you want to do is you want to take this number, this value, whether it's 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, and put it into a box, into an object box. And then once you've done that, then you can treat that as an object and do all kinds of, object-y things with it. Like, for example, put it into collections. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. First of all, this is, again, we're going through this template code again. This is really just giving you an idea of what you cannot do. When you're creating an NS array, you basically can't do this, where you're doing this array with objects 1, 2. You can't just stick these scalar values in there. You have to do something with those values. If you tried to do this, you would actually get a compilation error. Maybe those numbers might actually be treated as object pointers, in which case you would probably get a runtime error too. So I mean, basically this won't work.
It's wrong.
It's wrong.
Bad.
Don't do it.
Don't do it.
So let's take a look at what you actually can do. So here's what you actually wind up doing to basically do boxing. There's a special class called NSNumber, which was invented specifically for storing scalar values and stuff like that. It actually inherits from another class called NSValue, which we'll look at in just a minute, that lets you do even more stuff like this. But the idea is it's made for the purposes of holding all kinds of values, like numbers, like integers, floats, things like that. When we're working with values, then we'll see how you can actually use it to work with structures as well. So what you do essentially is you say NSNumber, and there's this factory method called number with int, and then you pass in that number. Now there's a whole bunch of these out there. There's number with int, there's number with float, there's number with integer, which is there for NSInteger. There's one for, I think there's a number with short int, and there's a whole bunch of these. If you look at the NSNumber documentation, you'll see all of these factory methods out there to be used with that. Once you've done this, then that actually creates an NSNumber object. As you can see here, we've got this NSNumber number 1, and this is now an object that contains the value that you put into it, that 1 value. Once you've got that, you can actually do stuff like number 1 int value and get that integer back out. Now, another cool thing that you can actually do with this is you can also use this as sort of a backdoor mechanism to convert it from one number to another as well. So
that is useful.
You could do things like put an integer in there and get a number or get a float out of it, and vice versa, those kinds of things. Now, some restrictions apply, as they say, in that it's not particularly smart about how it does its rounding of values and things. If you need some kind of specialized rounding to go on when you're making these conversions, then you might want to maybe do the mathematical manipulations yourself. Essentially, the NSNumber conversions between different number formats boils down to using the C function sprintf, which actually uses those format strings that we saw in the previous section. So in any case, so once you've got these objects like this number 1, this number 2 here, right, then you can actually create your array.
Because they're now objects.
Now they're objects, so you can just stuff them in there, and there's nothing to it. So if we were to run this code right now, we would actually see that it would actually do the right thing basically here. It'll print out our numbers just right there. And again, this is another example of that description method at work. The NSNumber description method knows enough about its value that it can turn it into a reasonably readable string there, right? So let's take a look at some more examples here. I mentioned that NSNumber inherits from NSValue. Okay, now NSValue was created originally to do this same kind of work, but NSValue allows you to do it with virtually any arbitrary C data type. And it's pretty clever how it does it. So let's imagine that we have this structure here. Remember our point from our original or early examples of dealing with structures, right? So we have this my point structure. It's got those old, float x and float y member variables there. And imagine that we've created one of these points and initialized it with the values of 45 and 42 for x and y. Now, normally you wouldn't be able to take a point, one of these my points, because it's a structure, you wouldn't be able to put it into a collection, right? So instead, what you have to do is you have to box it using NSValue. And the way that you do that is by using NSValue, you say NSValue value, and then you're going to pass the address of your your structure. Okay, that's what that address of, remember the ampersand operator, right? So address of point. And then in order to tell NSValue what type of data you're trying to encode inside of it, you need to use the parameter with obj_c type, and then you use this special @encode statement, and you pass the type of the value that you're putting in there. So in this case, because we are creating this struct my point, and we've typedefed that to just my point, then we can just do @encode and then my point. And NSValue is smart enough to say, oh, I see, this is a structure. And so I know basically what it does is it takes that address of that point structure and it says, okay, I know that this is so big because I know what data type it is. I know that it's a structure. And it can just take that memory after that and read that in and use that inside of NSValue. So once you've done that, then you can actually add that to your array, just like an object. Pretty cool stuff.
Excellent.
Now, NSValue also has, just like NSNumber has those factory methods for all those numbers, so for integers and things like that. NSValue also has a whole bunch of factory methods for things like CG points, which is a standard COCO structure that you use a lot when you're dealing with graphics and stuff like that, for CG rects as well. Basically, any of the standard structures that you might be working with in Objective-C, there's probably a constructor or a factory method on NSValue that will allow you to essentially suck it in and stick it into an NS array.
So how do I get my value back out of an NS value?
Well, there is I don't have an example of it here, but you can basically ask the NS value for that value back out, just like you did with the NSNumber earlier. You know, the NSNumber had that value as float. Let's see if we can go back there.
So we're just asking it. We just ask the object for its value, and it gives us back the correct thing.
Exactly, it gives you back the correct thing. So another thing that comes up sometimes is the need to, we talked about how you had that NS pointer table that would allow you to store arbitrary pointers, but maybe you also want to do that with collections too. Let's say you wanted to store some arbitrary C-style pointers inside of an NS array or an NS dictionary, like actually using one of those. So again, you can use NSValue there to box those pointers up so you can put them in there. Here's an example of where we have this char pointer called old school, and we're filling it with a string of dead beef, right? And inside of there, so once we've got this pointer, then just like we did with that structure, right, we are going to encode it using NSValue. And in this particular case, we're actually going to pass the address of old school, and we're going to encode it as a type of char pointer to pointer, because that's what we wind up passing here is that pointer to pointer value there.
Because we're passing the address of our pointer,
right,
effectively we're passing a pointer to a pointer.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And then once again, you can just pass that in to add object, and away you go. Nothing to it.
I guess that's really important. Otherwise, it's not going to know how to dereference the object properly to give you the value back.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. Exactly. So I just wanted to give a couple of other examples as far as the fact that you could also use this to mix and match numbers inside of your arrays. So if you wanted to add both integers and floats to your arrays, you could also use NSNumber to do that as well. You're not limited to just putting all integers in there. Remember that because NSNumber is going to store them all in a way that it can convert back and forth and so forth, you could, for example, have an integer that has, that's meaning of life 42. You could have another one that's the value of pi 3.14. That's a float. And you could create two different NSNumbers, one that's a number and one that's a float, and store both of those in the same array without any problems at all.
Cool.
So that's boxing values in a nutshell. And essentially, go ahead.
I think it's worth saying, NSNumber allows us to box. NSValue does. I think there's also an NSDecimal number as well for decimal
There is
things.
NSDecimal number. I thought about talking about that in this talk, but really NSDecimal number is used mostly for doing mathematical operations with NS numbers. So in other words, if you wanted to have like NSDecimal number, you had a number and you wanted to add another number to it using objects, that's what you would use NSDecimal number for. Not so much for boxing.
Not so much for boxing. But my point is these number objects are used in many places, especially in the modern APIs, more than just for boxing. So whereas in the older APIs you may expect functions to return integers or floats, a lot of the newer APIs and things like around core data and stuff, actually what you're going to get returned is an NS number.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. Core data in particular uses NSNumber a lot. And I think primarily that's just due to the fact that, it's using these collections internally and stuff like that. And so, it's basically doing that boxing for you. So, yes, definitely a very good point.
Okay. So, boxing.
Boxing.
We can tick it off the list.
Yes. Does that make it Boxing Day?
You have to hope we cut that out. No. So what are we finished boxing. I don't know which one of us won, but what are we going to do next?
Next up is NS data.
NS data.
Yes.
Cool.